April 1945. The air in the Rhineland did not smell of spring. It smelled of pulverized brick, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of spent shell casings. In the small town of Remagen, the morning light struggled to penetrate the thick, swirling haze of dust that hung over the streets like a funeral shroud. Beneath the ruins, in a cellar damp with the seepage of broken water mains, a group of German women huddled in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. They sat on crates of rotting potatoes and tattered wool blankets, their eyes fixed on the narrow cellar window that offered a sliver of the world above. For weeks, the radio had barked warnings of the Amidst, the Americans, describing them as soulless mercenaries, a horde of gangsters and savages who would show no mercy to the weak. To these women, the approaching rumble of engines was not the sound of liberation. It was the rhythmic heartbeat of an approaching apocalypse. Every tremor in the earth sent a fresh wave of terror through the room. They had heard the stories, carefully curated by the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, of what happened when a city fell. They expected fire. They expected the bayonet. They expected a cruelty that mirrored the desperate, scorched earth decrees of their own crumbling high command. A young mother named Marta clutched her 3-year-old daughter so tightly the child began to whimper, but Marta quickly pressed a hand over the girl's mouth. Even a breath felt too loud. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sulphurous stench of the nearby artillery duels that had finally fallen silent. That silence was the most terrifying thing of all. It meant the front line had moved past them. It meant the enemy was now in their streets. Above their heads, the floorboards of the ruined house groaned. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, the crunch of leather boots on broken glass. This was the moment they had been conditioned to fear since the first posters appeared in the town square, warning that a defeat would mean the end of the German soul. The women looked at one another, their faces gaunt, their skin gray from months of hiding and malnutrition. They were the wives and mothers of a Reich that had promised them 1,000 years of glory, now reduced to trembling shadows in a hole in the dirt. The vibration of the heavy machinery outside grew until the jars on the cellar shelves rattled and danced. It was a deep, guttural thrumming, the sound of countless pistons and the clatter of steel treads. Through the tiny window, they saw the shadows of giants passing by. The sun, momentarily obscured by a passing vehicle, cast long, jagged silhouettes against the cellar wall. To the women below, these were not men. They were the ironclad executors of a vengeful fate. They waited for the door at the top of the stairs to be kicked in. They waited for the shout, the flash of a muzzle, the end of their world. In the darkness of that cellar, the abundance of the coming age was unimaginable. They knew only the scarcity of hope and the suffocating pressure of a decade's worth of lies, pressing down on them as the first American boots came to a halt directly outside their door. To understand the terror of the German women in that cellar, one must understand the architecture of the lie they had lived within for 12 years. By 1945, the National Socialist apparatus had refined fear into a science. From the radio sets in every kitchen to the crimson banners draped over every town hall, the message was singular. The American soldier was a product of a degenerate, soulless society. Joseph Goebbels, the architect of this psychological wall, had painted the advancing Allied forces not as men, but as a mongrelized horde. The propaganda films shown in local cinemas depicted Americans as gangsters, men who lived for jazz, violence, and the destruction of European culture. For a decade, the German woman had been held up as the sacred guardian of the Aryan home, and she was told that the Amish were coming specifically to tear that home asunder. The historical context of this fear was rooted in the total mobilization of the German mind. By the time the front lines reached the Rhine, the civilian population was exhausted, starving, and psychologically fragile. They had endured years of Allied strategic bombing, a relentless rain of fire from the sky that reinforced the narrative of American heartlessness. The regime utilized this trauma, telling the women of the Rhineland and Westphalia that the men in the olive-drab uniforms were Luftgangsters, who had now come to finish the job on the ground. This was the wall of propaganda, a mental fortress that stood long after the physical defenses of the Siegfried Line had been breached. The German women were not just afraid of losing a war, they were afraid of being consumed by a perceived darkness that had no concept of law or mercy. This indoctrination created a staggering emotional contrast. In the Nazi worldview, there was only the master and the slave, the victor and the annihilated. They expected the Americans to operate under the same brutal logic that the German occupation had often applied in the East. They anticipated the Recht des Starkeren, the right of the stronger. Factual records from the era show that local Nazi officials often distributed cyanide capsules to women in the final days, whispering that a quick death was preferable to what the Americans would bring. The American Beast was a caricature built of racial prejudice and wartime desperation, a nightmare figure that loomed larger than the tanks themselves. Yet, this wall of lies was built on a foundation of sand. It relied on the absence of the other. The propaganda thrived because, for years, the American was an abstraction, a voice on a forbidden radio frequency or a silhouette in a grainy film. As the sound of the American First Army's trucks grew louder, the psychological tension reached a breaking point. The women did not know that they were about to encounter a force that defied every category they had been taught. They were prepared for a monster, holding their breath in the shadows of their cellars, unaware that the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal was not the bullet, but the inherent, messy, and abundant humanity of a democratic society that was about to walk through their door. The rumble began as a low-frequency vibration in the soles of their feet, long before the first vehicle rounded the bend of the village road. It was a mechanical symphony unlike anything the German people had produced in the final, desperate months of the war. There was no screech of worn-out metal, no sputtering of wood-gas engines. Instead, there was the rhythmic, high-pitched whine of heavy-duty alternators and the distinctive wet slap of synthetic rubber tires on ancient cobblestones. This was the arrival of the U.S. First Army, a motorized behemoth that seemed to move with a terrifying, fluid efficiency. As the first Willis Jeeps and M8 Greyhound armored cars rolled into view, the women watching from behind shuttered windows saw a vision of industrial power that felt alien to their experience of total war. The soldiers did not look like the pristine, stiff-backed infantry of the early Reich newsreels. They were covered in a thick patina of European road dust, their olive-drab uniforms stained with grease and salt. They sat slumped in their vehicles with a casual, almost reckless posture that the German observers found profoundly unsettling. To a population raised on the rigid Prussian discipline of the Wehrmacht, this American looseness was interpreted as the chaotic unpredictability of the gangster element Goebbels had warned them about. The soldiers wore heavy wool coats and webbing laden with pouches, their movements slow and deliberate as they scanned the rooftops with Browning machine guns. The sheer volume of equipment was staggering. Every truck seemed to overflow with crates, fuel cans, and spare tires, a material wealth that whispered of a continent that had not been starved of its resources. There was an eerie, suspended quality to the atmosphere. As the column came to a halt in the town square, the only sound was the ticking of cooling engines and the occasional sharp clatter of a soldier's boot against a stone. The American soldiers did not scream orders. They spoke in low, guttural tones, their voices carrying the strange melodic cadences of English, a language that, to the terrified women, sounded like the chatter of an occupying spirit. The soldiers looked tired, their eyes rimmed with the red fatigue of the Ardennes and the Hurtgen forest, yet they possessed an unmistakable air of confidence. They moved as if they owned the very air they breathed, a stark contrast to the hollowed-out, frantic energy of the retreating German units that had passed through only days before. The historical reality of this entry was one of overwhelming logistical superiority. For every German horse-drawn cart, there were a dozen American 2.5-ton deuce-and-a-half trucks. This abundance was not merely a military advantage, It was a psychological hammer blow. As the women watched these grim, dust-covered men dismount, they saw the physical manifestation of a world they had been told was collapsing. Instead, they were witnessing the vanguard of a civilization that had mastered the machine. The soldiers stood by their vehicles, smoking cigarettes with a nonchalance that suggested they were not merely winning a war, but finishing a job. The silent entry of the American column was the first crack in the glass of the Nazi reality, a moment where the sensory evidence of American power began to overwhelm the decades of ideological conditioning. As the American platoon fanned out across the village square, the women watching from their hiding places felt a primal, bone-deep chill. To the German civilians, the most terrifying aspect of the American soldier was the silhouette created by the M1 steel helmet. Unlike the flared coal scuttle shape of the German Stahlhelm, which had become a symbol of familiar, if harsh, authority, the American helmet was a deep, smooth dome that sat low on the brow. In the harsh midday sun, the brim cast a thick, impenetrable shadow over the soldiers' eyes, effectively erasing their humanity. These were the helmeted invaders, figures who looked less like men and more like faceless automatons of war. Every movement they made, the sharp pivot of a torso, the cradling of a Thompson submachine gun, was viewed through a lens of extreme prejudice and manufactured dread. The square, once the heart of a bustling community, had become a stage for what the women assumed would be a massacre. They watched as the GIs moved in pairs, clearing corners with a practiced lethal grace. The soldiers didn't look for people, they looked for targets. This clinical approach to urban clearing was interpreted by the terrified onlookers as the cold indifference of a professional executioner. Historical accounts from the 1945 Rhineland campaign frequently mentioned this specific atmospheric tension, the terrifying otherness of the American gear. The dark webbing, the bulky field jackets, and the strange multicolored camouflage netting stretched over their helmets made them appear as forest monsters emerging from the ancient German woods to reclaim the land. In the minds of the women, the shadow beneath the helmet was filled with the visage of the gangster they had been promised. They expected to see eyes gleaming with the sadistic joy described in the Völkischer Beobachter. To them, the Americans were not individuals. They were a collective force of destruction. When a soldier paused to kick a piece of debris or signal a squad mate, the women flinched, certain that the signal was a command for the commencement of atrocities. The emotional weight of this moment was staggering. A decade of being told they were the center of the universe had ended in a cellar, watching faceless men in green uniforms take possession of their world. The symbolism of the helmet was central to this initial terror. It represented the hardened American, a man who had crossed an ocean not to liberate, but to annihilate. The sheer uniformity of the platoon, with their identical steel shells and rugged gear, suggested an unstoppable industrial process. There was no room for negotiation with a steel dome. As the platoon sergeant raised a hand to halt his men directly in front of a row of cottages, the silence in the square was so brittle it seemed it might shatter like the glass under their boots. The women held their breath, their hearts hammering against their ribs, waiting for the faceless shadows to turn toward their doors and bring the predicted end. The door to the farmhouse kitchen did not burst open with the violence of a grenade blast. Instead, it groaned on its hinges, yielding to the steady pressure of a gloved hand. Marta stood frozen behind the heavy oak table, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of a chair. Beside her, an elderly neighbor clutched a rosary, the beads clicking in a frantic, rhythmic prayer. In the doorway stood the silhouette they had dreaded, a tall, bulky figure in olive drab, the M1 Garand rifle held across his chest. The soldier's face was a dark void beneath the deep curve of his helmet, the eyes hidden in shadow, the jawline obscured by a chin strap. To Marta, he was the personification of the Reich's final warnings, the vengeful victor come to claim his spoils. She closed her eyes, waiting for the harsh bark of a foreign command or the cold steel of a bayonet. Then, the soldier did something entirely outside the Nazi script. He shifted his weight, leaned his rifle against the doorframe, and reached up with both hands. With a metallic clatter of the strap, he lifted the heavy steel helmet from his head. As the helmet came away, the monster vanished. In its place was a young man, perhaps no older than 20, with a shock of sandy brown hair matted down by sweat and the pressure of the liner. His forehead was pale compared to his sunburnt cheeks, and his eyes, tired, bloodshot, but unmistakably kind, blinked in the dim light of the kitchen. He wasn't a gangster from a Goebbels film. He was a boy from the wheat fields of Iowa or the streets of Brooklyn. He looked less like a conqueror and more like a weary traveler who had walked across a continent just to find a place to rest. The transformation was instantaneous and jarring. The removal of the helmet broke the spell of ideological terror that had held the room captive. Marta felt the air return to her lungs in a jagged gasp. The soldier didn't scowl. He offered a small, awkward, lopsided grin that revealed a chipped front tooth. He wiped his brow with the back of a dirty sleeve and looked around the humble kitchen with a sense of quiet curiosity. There was no master race in this room anymore. Only a group of frightened women and a tired American boy who seemed more interested in the smell of the kitchen than in the political alignment of its occupants. This was the first contact, a moment where the grand, sweeping narratives of total war collapsed into the simple, undeniable reality of two human beings looking at one another without the distortion of steel. Historical records from the 1945 occupation often highlight this specific revelation. The Amos were human. They bled, they laughed, and they missed their mothers. As the soldier took a step forward, his boots no longer sounded like the drums of doom, but like the heavy steps of a guest. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for something else, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle them. The tension in the room remained, but its nature had changed from a fear of death to a profound, disorienting confusion. The wall had been breached, not by artillery, but by the simple act of a soldier baring his head in a civilian home, exposing the humanity that the helmet had so effectively hidden. The young soldier reached into the deep pocket of his field jacket, his fingers fumbling past extra ammunition clips and a grease-stained map. Marta's breath hitched, her body tensing for the emergence of a weapon. Instead, he withdrew a small, rectangular object wrapped in a dull, silver-colored foil. With a practiced flick of his thumb, he tore the edge of the wrapper, revealing a dark, rich substance that shimmered in the afternoon light. He broke off a square and held it out toward Marta's daughter, who was peering cautiously from behind her mother's apron. The scent hit Marta's nostrils instantly, a heavy, sweet aroma of cocoa and sugar that felt like a sensory hallucination. In a Germany where ersatz coffee was made of roasted acorns and bread was cut with sawdust, the smell of genuine chocolate was the scent of a forgotten world. This was the Hershey's bar, a standard component of the American field ration, or K-ration. To the United States military, it was a high-calorie energy supplement designed for the rigors of combat. To the German women, it was a symbol of an almost mythical abundance. Historically, the Third Reich had been under a state of total war austerity for years. By 1945, the civilian ration was a starvation diet of watery soup and black bread. The German tropical chocolate, Coca-Cola, was a bitter, caffeine-laden stimulant reserved for pilots and tank crews. Yet here was a common foot soldier, standing in a ruined kitchen, casually offering a luxury that even the highest Nazi Party officials in the district could no longer easily obtain. The soldier nudged his hand forward again, a silent gesture of reassurance. Marta watched as her daughter reached out, her small fingers trembling as they touched the silver foil. When the child tasted the chocolate, her eyes widened in a look of pure, unadulterated shock. It was not just the taste. It was the realization of the power required to produce such a thing in the midst of a global war. The Hershey's bar was the physical manifestation of American logistics, a system so vast and so efficient that it could supply its frontline troops with millions of tons of sugar, milk, and cocoa while the master race was reduced to scavenging for nettles. This was the symbol of abundance that began to de-escalate the civilian terror more effectively than any loudspeaker announcement. As the soldier watched the child eat, he leaned against the counter and pulled out a tin of Lucky Strike cigarettes, another silver-wrapped item of impossible luxury. The contrast was devastating. The propaganda had promised that America was a land of breadlines and social chaos, a crumbling society of decadent plutocrats. Yet the evidence in front of Marta was undeniable. The American soldier was the best-fed, best-clothed, and most well-equipped individual she had ever seen. The silver wrapper, crinkling in the child's hand, was a mirror reflecting the total failure of the Nazi state. It represented a civilization that could afford to be merciful because it possessed the luxury of plenty. In that kitchen, the war was being won not by the rifle, but by the sheer, crushing weight of a democracy that could turn chocolate into a bridge across the abyss of hate. As the American presence in the village shifted from tactical occupation to administrative reality, a new phenomenon began to unfold in the local schoolhouse, which had been hastily converted into a battalion aid station. Marta watched from her doorway as a line of wounded men, both American GIs and German soldiers who had been captured in the nearby woods, were carried in on stretchers. To the German civilians, this was an impossibility. In the ideological landscape of the Third Reich, mercy was a sign of weakness, and medical resources were a zero-sum game reserved for the worthy. They expected the Americans to leave the wounded Germans to die or, worse, to accelerate their end. Instead, they witnessed what historians call the logic of mercy, the clinical, egalitarian application of American medical logistics. Inside the aid station, the air was thick with the smell of ether and the copper tang of blood. A captain in the U.S. Army Medical Corps, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, moved between the litters with a focused mechanical intensity. He did not ask for the ideology of the man on the table. He checked for a pulse and the severity of the trauma. German women, who had volunteered to help scrub floors and carry water, stood in stunned silence as they saw American medics using precious sulfa powder and morphine on the very boys who had been firing at them only hours before. This was not the behavior of the barbarians described in the radio broadcasts. It was a manifestation of a democratic ethos that prioritized the preservation of life over the purity of the cause. The emotional contrast was devastating for the observers. For years, they had been told that they belonged to a superior race, yet their own government had abandoned them to the fire. Now, the inferior enemy was sharing his blood plasma and his bandages. Factual data from the campaign shows that American medical units often treated thousands of German civilians and POWs during the push toward the Elbe, fueled by a supply chain that provided an abundance of life-saving penicillin, a drug the German pharmaceutical industry had failed to mass-produce. To the women of the town, every bandage applied to a German soldier was a silent refutation of the Nazi creed. It proved that the American strength was not just in the metal of their tanks, but in the resilience of their ethics. This shift in perception transformed the atmosphere of the village. The master race ideology, which demanded the elimination of the weak, collapsed when faced with the sight of an American medic gently cleaning the shrapnel wounds of a terrified 16-year-old German recruit. The women saw that the victors were not governed by the same bloodlust that had consumed their own leaders. The Americans possessed a surplus of everything, including compassion. This logic of mercy acted as a psychological solvent, dissolving the last remnants of the Amos myth. It was the beginning of a realization that the war was not just a battle for territory, but a conflict between a system that worshipped death and one that, however imperfectly, valued the individual. In the quiet of the aid station, the German women saw the first true evidence of a peace that could actually be lived in. By the end of the first week of occupation, the pervasive silence of the village was replaced by a new, tentative sound, the exchange of stories. The American GIs, now billeted in the local houses and barns, had begun to settle into a routine of administrative boredom and logistical maintenance. In the evenings, sitting on porch steps or around makeshift fires, the soldiers engaged in a form of soft diplomacy that the Nazi high command had never anticipated. They pulled weathered, sepia-toned photographs from their wallets, images of white picket fences in Ohio, sun-drenched porches in Georgia, and laughing families at picnic tables in California. To the German women, who had been taught that America was a land of racial warfare and social decadence, these glimpses into the domestic life of the enemy were a profound shock. This was the language of the victors, a communication that bypassed linguistic barriers through the universal iconography of family and home. When a soldier pointed to a photo of his mother and said the word "Mom," or showed a picture of his sweetheart back home, he was dismantling a decade of dehumanization. The propaganda had insisted these men were soulless gangsters, but the photos revealed they were sons, brothers, and husbands. Historical accounts from the 1945 Rhineland campaign frequently document this specific turning point. The realization that the American soldier was a product of a stable, loving society, rather than a chaotic, lawless wasteland, shattered the last remnants of the anti-Bolshevik and anti-Western narratives that Goebbels had so carefully constructed. The emotional impact of these interactions was rooted in the concept of belonging. The German women saw that the American soldiers did not hate them, they simply wanted to go home. The soldiers' casual talk of their civilian jobs, carpenters, clerks, teachers, and farmers, offered a vision of a world where one's identity was not defined by the state or the military, but by one's community and family. This was the true face of democracy, a society where the individual was the primary unit of value. The contrast with the German experience of Volksgemeinschaft, a community defined by exclusion and total submission to the Führer, could not have been more stark. As curiosity replaced terror, the women began to ask questions, often through broken English and hand gestures. They wanted to know about the abundance they saw, the endless fuel for the jeeps, the mountains of canned goods, and the seemingly inexhaustible supply of coffee. The soldiers answered with a shrug and a smile, often sharing their rations as they spoke. This wasn't the calculated, generous distribution of a political party. It was the natural, unthinking sharing of a people who had never known the desperate scarcity of the European theater. By showing their families and sharing their stories, the Americans were not just occupying territory. They were occupying the hearts and minds of a defeated population, replacing the dark myths of the Reich with the bright, undeniable reality of a common human experience. The language of the victors proved that the most effective way to defeat an ideology was to simply show the truth of a better one. The psychological collapse of the old order did not happen in a single moment of dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, crushing weight of physical evidence. By the second week of April 1945, the German women of the Rhineland were forced to confront a reality that no amount of ideological gymnastics could explain away. For years, they had been told that the Third Reich was the pinnacle of industrial and social organization, while the American plutocracy was a decaying shell of a nation. Yet, as they stood in their doorways, they saw the abundance of American logistics manifest in a way that felt like a mathematical impossibility. They saw endless convoys of GMC trucks that never seemed to run out of fuel, while their own fathers and sons had been reduced to using horse-drawn carts and wood-burning engines. This was the burden of truth, the realization that they had been lied to not just about the character of their enemies, but about the very nature of the world. The psychological impact of this material superiority was profound. To the German mind, which had been conditioned to equate strength with rigid, state-controlled discipline, the sight of a casual American private eating out of a tin of Spam, while leaning against a mountain of crated supplies, was a form of heresy. It proved that the democratic system, which Goebbels had mocked as chaotic and weak, had outproduced, outfed, and outsupplied the master race. Historically, the German civilian population had been enduring total war measures since 1943, sacrificing every comfort for a victory that was supposed to be inevitable. Seeing the casual, discarded waste of the American army, the half-eaten rations, the discarded cigarette packs, the endless tires, shattered the belief in the Nazi Party's competence. If the regime could not even feed its people while the decadent Americans had chocolate to give to children, then the regime was not just evil, it was a failure. This realization led to a quiet, pervasive collapse of the Nazi ideology among the women. They began to see the symbols of the Reich for what they truly were, the hollow remnants of a death cult. The final victory, Endsieg posters, still peeling on the walls of the village, looked absurd in the shadow of a single American M4 Sherman tank. The women recognized that the American victory was not just a matter of better generals or luck. It was the inevitable result of a society that empowered its citizens rather than enslaving them. Factual records from the period indicate a sharp decline in Nazi Party membership and a surge in civilian cooperation with Allied military government officials during this window, driven by the sheer pragmatism of survival and the recognition of American competence. For Marta and the others, the burden of truth was heavy. It meant accepting that the sacrifices of their husbands and the deaths of their neighbors had been for a lie. The abundance of the victors served as a constant, shimmering reminder of what Germany had lost by following a path of hatred. Every jeep that hummed past was a testament to a world of commerce, industry, and freedom that they had been denied. The psychological shift was permanent. They were no longer the proud guardians of an empire. They were a defeated people who were beginning to understand that their liberation was coming from the very monsters they had feared. The collapse of the old order was complete, cleared away by the sight of a GI tossing an empty C-ration tin into a trash heap, a gesture of plenty that the Reich could never match. As the dust of the final advance settled into the fertile soil of the German heartland, the terror that had once paralyzed the women of the Rhineland evaporated, leaving behind a profound and lasting silence. The war was not merely over in a military sense. It had ended in the minds and spirits of those who had huddled in the cellars. The image of the helmeted invader had been permanently replaced by the memory of a dusty young man with a tired smile, a soldier who had bared his head in a civilian kitchen and offered a small, silver-wrapped luxury to a frightened child. This simple act, the removal of the helmet, was the true beginning of the reconstruction of a shattered nation. It was a gesture that signaled the transition from the dark, insular paranoia of the Third Reich to the messy, vibrant, and abundant reality of the democratic world. The Hershey's bar, once a strange and exotic artifact of an enemy power, remained in the collective memory as the echo of the silver wrapper. It became a recurring symbol of the era, a bridge between two worlds that had been destined to destroy one another. To the women who lived through those weeks in 1945, the chocolate was more than a treat. It was the physical proof that freedom possessed a material weight that tyranny could never achieve. Historically, this period marked the foundation of the post-war German-American relationship, a bond forged not in the halls of diplomacy, but in the kitchens and village squares where individual GIs demonstrated the inherent decency of their society. The abundance of the American logistic chain had fed the body, but it was the abundance of the American spirit that had begun to heal the psychological scars of a generation. This transformation highlights a larger truth about the nature of freedom and the ideology of the Reich. The Nazi state had demanded total sacrifice for a hollow glory, while the American democracy had offered a simple, human connection backed by the strength of an industrial giant. The removal of the helmet was a rejection of the faceless, mechanical cruelty of total war in favor of the individual face and the individual voice. As the women emerged from their cellars into the bright, uncertain light of a new Europe, they carried with them the realization that the Amos had not come to destroy their humanity, but to restore it. They had learned that the most powerful weapon against a lie is not a greater lie, but the undeniable presence of the truth. In the decades that followed, the memory of that first contact became a foundational myth of the new Germany. It served as a poetic reflection on the resilience of the human spirit and the inevitable victory of abundance over scarcity and light over shadow. The silver wrapper, crinkled and discarded in the ruins of 1945, remains a testament to a moment when the world changed, a moment when a helmet was lifted, a hand was extended, and the long, cold night of the 20th century began to yield to the dawn. The story of the German women and the American soldiers is a reminder that even in the depths of the greatest conflict in human history, the smallest acts of humanity are the ones that define the future. Freedom, it turned out, did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with the quiet crinkle of silver foil and the sight of an enemy who chose to become a friend.